Hello, I'm Roger Williams.
And I'm Sherry Williams.
So, we're here to talk about normal. Now, this is the sign for normal, but we really just want to throw out that word. In our house, well, it's not normal. Yeah, we've got a dryer. You throw the clothes in, put the setting on normal, but there's nothing else about our house that anyone would describe as normal. So we really just want to discard that word. And what we want to talk about, is that every family, whether it's two parents, one parent, three parents, four parents, one kid, two kids, we have six, but however many you have, that's all normal. And so we don't like that word. We want to talk about judging your house on its own. Everyone is unique.
As Roger mentioned, we are the parents of 6 children. 2 are hearing and 4 are deaf. All 6 children have unique needs. We don't like to use the word special needs, which can have a negative connotation. We prefer to use the phrase unique needs. I'm a retired college professor. Prior to teaching at the college level, I was a teacher of the deaf, and I have taught first grade through high school. I taught children for about 20 years before transitioning to the college level. There, I taught ASL, American Sign Language, as well as deaf history and culture for almost 18 years. I just retired, and while I stay home, I keep very busy.
So, I used to work for the Department of Mental Health, the Director of Deaf Services across the state of South Carolina. Before that, I was a social worker working in hospitals. South Carolina Signs Hospital, a little bit different, but I worked in group homes, worked at the residential school for the deaf. I'm also a certified interpreter for, let's just say, many years. I don't want to say how many, but we'll just leave it at, well, more than 20, more than 30, more than 40, getting all too close to 50. So I also have recently retired. So, as my wife just said, we have 6 children with unique needs. Again, we don't like the word special, but they have unique needs. So, I think the biggest, well, you might say challenge, but we're going to look at it as an opportunity, is the linguistic deprivation that many of our children arrived at our family with very little or no language. Sometimes people say, well, you can't have no language. Well, I'm going to beg to disagree. One of our children who arrived when she was 6 had no concept that people could talk. She didn't know that hearing people could talk. She didn't know that she herself was deaf. She just didn't have the idea that you could take one thought from one person and give it to another person. So that whole concept of language was not there. So we were dealing with that. Many of our children, joined our family recovering from abuse, neglect, variety of adverse impact. So we have had to deal with that for several of them. Intellectually, our house, it really is a broad range from intellectual disability all the way to intellectually gifted. Not sure about that phrase, but but for us, it just means that each of our 6 children, each of them is very unique. And people say, well, might be easier to deal with the child who's the gifted child, but no, we had to have special rules at home, like you have to look at the teacher twice an hour. You must pretend to be reading your school book during recess time. You have to look like you're paying attention. And if you don't do those things, you can't go to the regular library to check out books. You'll be stuck with just what's in the elementary school library, which for that child was a terrible thing to threaten him with. But but of course, this is a child who, when he got to graduate school, didn't know how to study or write papers from research. He just memorized everything he'd ever read. So, we have from that end of the spectrum all the way, we have a child who has a mild cognitive impairment. And that means it's a lot, hours and hours sometimes.
It requires frequent repetition.
Of repetition just to master simple skills.
You have to find different ways of explaining how to do a task, which can be challenging.
We deal with attachment disorder. And attachment is that sense that your caretaker will take care of you, whether that's your parents, a caregiver, someone. But for some of our children, their early experiences of such neglect that there was nobody to care for them. And that means now, they've joined our family, but they don't know how to deal with somebody who wants to take care of them, wants to hold them, wants to love them. One didn't even know how to be hugged. If you tried to hug him, he became stiff as a board. He just didn't know what to do with that kind of attachment. So sometimes I think the frustration that I know you experienced.
One of the most frustrating challenges we've experienced with our children is ADD and ADHD. Research has shown that a very high percentage of deaf children have ADD or ADHD. I'm sure a few of you parents have faced those same challenges with your own children. It can be challenging trying to find the right medication or behavior management for your child, or trying to explain to the teachers why your child needs extra help. Yes, we've had to deal with that.
So, we know that what you want to know is everything.
And the answers that we have are none. So sorry. But we can offer hope. Yes, there is hope out there. It is important to be optimistic and to believe hope is out there. We can offer pathways that will lead to solutions. Now, all of you parents out there today have an easier time finding resources. In the past, parents were often stumped on what to do. But now you have the internet to help search for some answers. There's also social media, for example, Facebook, where you can connect with other parents. Oh, there are many different ways to find information. For example, there are conferences you can attend to learn more about how to work with your child and find the answers you need.
So when we talk about hope, what does hope mean? For our family, and we hope for your family, we have 6 children. 5 of them are living independently. They own their own homes. They're starting new families. 3 of them already have children. We have 7 grandchildren. You're lucky you're not here, because if you're here, we would be forced to show you pictures of all of our 7 grandchildren. But you don't need to endure that. But we have 7 gorgeous grandchildren. The newest one, oh, she's only 3 weeks old. But anyway, I'm going to put that aside. So we have 7 grandchildren. 3 of our children have children. 2 of them have told us they're trying, and we're not going to be asking how, but they're trying to have children. So we anticipate more grandchildren in the immediate future. They all work in competitive employment. They own their own homes. They are settled. And again, we're still a broad range. We're still working with, Some are working in the service industry, some are working in the top levels of technology. So we have one whose job it is to pay for my nursing home when I become old enough to need one. So, we're going to let him earn the money. But we have that broad range, but still, they are working. They're doing well. One is a single parent of 3, and she is still struggling with being independent, so she still has a lot of parental support. But as we discuss later on, they're happy. Our youngest, well, he's still at home. We're, I'm not going to say pushing, we're encouraging him towards independence. And hopefully, by the time you watch this, he will have started a new work. He's supposed to be starting just next week. So he's started jobs before, but, we are always optimistic. And we are sure this will work. But understand, as Sherry was discussing a little bit earlier, with ADD, we know their brains, their frontal lobes, their development is a little bit behind. That part of the brain, is the one that helps you make executive function decisions, deciding what's good or bad, what's the consequence of making a decision. And for kids with ADD, that really doesn't fully develop until they're almost 25. And he will be 24 when you watch this, because he's just 23 right now, but 24 next week. So we know that we are finally starting to see some of that maturity start to develop. He's starting to make better decisions. So all of our 6 are doing well. We have desires. Like all of us, we have hopes, we have dreams, we have visions of what we all want our children to be. And it's important to recognize that, we have 6 children. The first one, when they were born, I'm old enough to be involved in Lamaze classes. If you don't know what that means, you'll have to go Google it. But anyway, Lamaze classes talk to, with new parents about the birth process and when the child is born. So they asked me, what did I want? And I, said a healthy baby, always a good, safe answer. And they said, well, let's be a little bit more specific. So, all right. So I picked a red-haired, brown-eyed girl. Always another safe answer to, pick one who looks like your wife. So brown-eyed, red-haired girl. And our first child was, through business, a brown-eyed, red-haired girl. Whew. But no matter what that goal is, sometimes it doesn't work out. Just recently we had an opportunity to take a bucket list vacation after we had retired. We went to Australia, and I had wanted to go scuba diving. I had not yet been before. My wife, she is an expert with many years of experience. But we got there, and they said because of my health, I wasn't able to go scuba diving. I could just go snorkeling. I was disappointed. I had a vision, a goal, but I had to recognize that, a little bit depressed, a little bit disappointed, but okay, fine. I go on this new experience of snorkeling for the first time, and to be honest, I had a little bit better experience than she did. I saw all kinds of fishes, including a shark, which was really cool. But first, we need to recognize that we have these dreams, these goals, these desires, and that sometimes those are not what's going to happen, but that what actually happens is also good.
All of you parents have desires for your child. A perfectly normal feeling. Perhaps you want your child to become a successful adult. Yes, there will be some bumps in the road. However, your vision and hope for the future is for your child to grow up to become a successful adult. to get a good job after graduation. Actually, you hope they will graduate from high school and get a job. You hope that your child will make you proud. That is a normal emotion. A parent wants to be proud of their child, and you want them to be proud of you too. Most of all, you want your child to be happy. Going back to wanting your child to be successful. How do you measure success? What does success mean? How do you define it?
So each of us defines success differently. For some people, it might mean sports. That wouldn't be me. Sherry is more the athlete. I know that baseball involves a stick and a ball, and I have no hope of ever hitting it, but, that is perfectly fine if that's what it is. It might be academics, good grades. And even then, what does that mean for each child? And more importantly, for each of your children, that definition is going to be different. What I have in mind it's got to be what do they have in mind. And I want to give you some bad news, especially for those of you who've got teenagers at home. You don't control a whole lot of their lives. By the time a child is 12, the parents are only responsible for about 5% of their traits at that point in time. By the time they get to be 16, you don't really have any control over the traits. Knowledge, yes, you can give them information, but personality, parents don't have a lot of impact compared to certainly those early developmental years when that is so important. So, their definition of success will be their definition. It might mean graduating high school, it might mean graduating college, it might mean going to a job. And again, that job can have a lot of variety. When we work with parents, and often their goals of success really don't match the child's.
As a parent, your job, so to speak, is to raise your child to become a successful adult. This means raising your child to become self-supporting, earning an income to pay their bills, becoming independent and not relying on you to support them for the rest of their life, and hopefully not becoming dependent upon SSI, which does not pay much, and your child still remains dependent upon their parents. So that's your job, to raise your child to become independent, successful, and to make enough money to support themselves.
So, as we were talking, not a challenge, but an opportunity that we have at home is that language deprivation. And definitely the biggest struggle because, we talk about that language window that closes around 6 years old. So that means that we've got to get that language in there, and our children have often arrived at our family after 6. So how do we open up that window and provide some of that? So first, being a bilingual home, our home is bilingual. That means we have spoken and written English and American Sign Language. And often those are happening at the same time. I'm not talking about simultaneous communication, but what I mean is that we may be writing something, maybe text. We text all the time. I've got to tell you, I text with very precise English. I have all the punctuation, periods and ellipses and exclamation points, because it's one way to teach kids how to read and write. And obviously, they come back with BRB, LOL, IOY, whatever it is, but I am going to text the entire sentence. So, but at home, we're reading and writing. Oh, we read every night. We sign the stories every night. Our dining room table, when we're all sitting around the table, everybody's involved. We have 2 hearing kids, They may be talking, but they're also going to sign. Sometimes they're going to be using simultaneous communication, but whatever. But what is going on? It doesn't mean that all of you have to become interpreters, but it means you've got to have enough language to be able to start. Maybe just start with finger spelling. Start with the basic signs: mom, dad, food, home. Not just stop and no and don't. Yeah, of course, obviously, as parents, we have to say no and stop. But one time I remember we had a little girl in our house. She was Russian, and, I don't speak. She was hearing. I need to let you know her brothers were deaf, but we were taking care of that family, and we are also serve as foster parents. And we were taking care of them, and this little girl, sometimes my Russian is not very good, and the first word I knew was "niet." One day she just fussed at me, saying "niet, niet, niet" all the time. All I ever hear was "niet." And I had to recognize I had made that mistake because that was my word that I was best at in Russian, and I needed to be more providing it with praise and saying good. So working on those positive words. So you need to try to be ahead of the kids with language. Of course, the kids will be happy to teach you. Sometimes you may want to check with a deaf adult to be sure they're teaching you the right sign. But we want to talk about everything that's going on. I remember the first deaf child that we had into our family. We had already planned a vacation up to Williamsburg, Virginia. It's a colonial kind of restoration. And we get there, and he didn't have any sign language. And we happened to walk past a cow. Well, it was really a bull out there in the pasture. And he looked at it, and I said, "Well, that's a bull." And understand he was 4 at that time, not 6. He was 4, and I said, "That's a bull," and he said, "That's a bull." I said, "Yeah, that's a bull." And he said, "That's a bull," and I said, "Yes, that's a bull." Oh, probably 6 or 7 times we had a little interchange, and finally the light went on. And so every time he saw that bull, he had to let us all know there was a bull or a cow or whatever it was. And then the next sign he learned was stop. And the reason for that was, now there's no cars in Williamsburg, just horse-drawn carriages. And so we're getting to an intersection, and I said, "Oh, you gotta look and stop." And I said, "Yeah, you have to stop, wait for the horse." So now he started to tell us stop, and we'd be walking along, he'd tell us to stop. And why? Way down the street, probably 10 minutes away by horse, was a carriage slowly plodding along the street, and we had to stop and wait and look around until finally the horse-drawn carriage went past and we could walk across. So our vacation, we spent a lot of it stopping and waiting for horses to go past. But anyway, the point is we had that communication about everything that we saw, the trees, the birds, the animals, whatever was in that environment. Give them words for everything. Did they understand the first time? Of course not. Did they understand 10 times? Maybe. Did they understand after the 100th time? Well, we certainly hope so. But every time they see a word, we're going to talk about it around the house, the chairs, the sofa, the table, the books, the lights, whatever it is, what's on television. Our captioning is on all the time. And that provides those words and understand, start to put together, those words maybe with what they see on the television.
I want to add to that about communicating about everything in your environment. Not only is it teaching specific vocabulary words, but it's also explaining things. Think about yourself growing up as a hearing child. Most of you are hearing parents with a deaf child. How did you learn information? By listening. By overhearing conversations around you in the background. Your parents talking to each other, listening to the radio, or maybe going to the grocery store with your mother. You heard people having conversations around you. Maybe you went to a restaurant and you overheard people at the next table talking about things. You pick up so much information that way. Maybe, for example, you hear your parents talking about Uncle Bob is in the hospital and they're planning to run some tests. Now, imagine yourself as a deaf child. You see your parents talking with worried expressions on their faces, and you ask, "What's wrong?" And then your parent says, "Uncle Bob." And you think, "What's wrong with Uncle Bob?" And then you catch the word hospital, and your parents just kind of brush you off. Maybe the parents don't have the sign language to explain these concepts to a small child. Now this poor child is so worried about Uncle Bob being in the hospital and thinking this means he may die there and has no idea what's going on with Uncle Bob. That's why I'm emphasizing the importance of explaining things. What I just described is called incidental learning. Incidental learning means to hear what's going on in your environment and just naturally absorb the information you are hearing. A deaf child does not have the auditory capacity to learn the same way, which is why it's so important to give a more concrete explanation to them.
So, academic potential, what does that mean? For parents, that means you have to advocate, to encourage. You have to know what is their reasonable potential. We both worked at residential school, not Texas, it was in another state, but we worked at residential schools, and often parents would come with, sometimes they would want their child who's really struggling in school, and they expect them to become the president of the United States. And then some parents, their child is doing well, but the parents thought, well, they won't be able to get a job. So there was this just real mismatch between the child's potential and what the parents were expecting. So ask for an assessment, ask for a language assessment, learn what is a reasonable goal for your child, and understand that doesn't mean to set a limit. We have one child who, her intellectual, was tested by a great psychologist, and her IQ was, into the mild cognitive impairment range. But that child graduated with an associate's degree, works full-time. She's independent. She lives independent, but you can't look just at IQ alone. You've got to look at her motivation, her assertiveness, and see that she is doing fine. So you've got to look at, not just the number, but the child as a whole. And you've got to be involved in their education, their IEP meetings. I'll let you in on a secret. I hate IEP meetings. They are just a horrible experience. I have a difficult job. I've been shot at. Fortunately, it missed, but I've been shot at. I've been beaten up. I've been knocked out cold. I've been thrown downstairs. I've had broken bones. IEP meetings are still worse in my mind. So, that IEP meeting, those are tough, but you've got to go. You've got to be there to advocate for your child and to let your child, the child has to be there. Even if they're only 6 or 7 or 8 years old, have them be there. They know themselves even better than you know them, maybe, and you know them better than the teachers. The teachers may be great, but they only see the child for 1 or 2, 3, 4 hours a day. You see them 6, 7, 8 hours a day. So working together means we can advocate, we can speak up. It means you've got to be there. And if something's not right, what you know your child needs, means you need to advocate for them all the time, for what they need, until they can advocate for themselves. One of our children, just really very assertive, went to an IEP meeting, and they had this whole conversation. She said, no, I need this, and this. and she was probably, 14 years old and still linguistically delayed, but she knew what she needed, and she had the confidence and the assertiveness to be there and get it. The expressions on the teachers' faces were interesting, but and at 18, of course, they need to sign for themselves. At one school, they told us we had to sign. No. The child needs to sign. The school had never asked for kids to sign themselves. So don't just encourage, force them to advocate for themselves.
We were discussing the child advocating for themselves. Now, that usually happens at an older age, let's say from about age 12 or 13 and on. Until they reach that age, parents must advocate for the child. However, parents need to be aware of the benchmarks. They need to know the child's potential. If they know a child should be familiar with vocabulary words for a specific age, and they see that their own child is not making coherent sentences, they should be aware of the benchmarks for that age so they can compare their child's progress with those benchmarks. My child is behind. Then they can put pressure on the school. He's not reading at that level. How are you planning to pull up his reading level? What can we do at home to help, and what can you do at school to increase his reading level and improve those scores? The early years are critical. If they are not up to their peers' level, let's say by second or third grade language level, they will begin to fall behind. It becomes difficult to catch them up, so it's important to start young. If you have a 4 or 5-year-old child, look at other children of the same age. If you notice your child is behind, then start prompting the school officials to do something. So you need to know what to look for. This means do your research, talk with other parents, talk with other teachers, look on the internet, and talk with other deaf adults as well. Observe other deaf children. If they have good language skills, try to find out what they're doing and see if you can incorporate those strategies into your own family. Social interaction with other deaf adults and other deaf children is so important. It will help you to gauge how your child is progressing, and it will provide role models for your children. Your child will watch them, identify with them, and learn from older deaf children and deaf adults. I grew up as the only deaf child in an all-hearing school. And today, many deaf children tend to be mainstreamed as the only deaf child in the whole school. That was me back then. I had never met a deaf adult in all those years. It so happened when I was 10 years old, I asked my mom when I would get rid of that hearing aid. I said, "When can I throw it away?" And my mom didn't understand what I meant. Oh, by the way, I was talking to her. I was oral and knew no sign language at all. So my mom said, "What do you mean?" And I said, "When do I stop using my hearing aid?" My mom became very sad and told me, "You will always use a hearing aid." I was puzzled and asked, "Will I always be deaf?" And my mom replied, "You will never be able to hear normally." Oh, I was devastated. I cried constantly for 2 or 3 days. I was very depressed. You know why? I thought I would die when I grew up because I had never met another deaf adult. I thought I would live to only be a certain age and then I would die. That is why it's so important for your child to be exposed to deaf adults.
So, as Sherry was just saying, that social interaction. One of our hearing kids who thought she was going to become deaf when she became 6 because she hadn't seen hearing children. She had gone to the residential school in the day program, and she just assumed that when she got to be 6, she would become deaf, because the preschool had hearing and deaf kids both, but of course everybody signed because they all had deaf parents. But she just thought that when you turned 6, you'd be in the deaf school, and when she discovered she was going to be hearing for life. But on the other hand, our girl from China thought that in China, when they found out that a child was deaf, they would call America, and then a family would go and get them and bring them to America, because she had never seen a deaf adult in China. And she got to America, and there were all these deaf adults who were here. So, kids end up with their own theory about how the world works. So having that exposure is important. So, as we talked, just in the same way, though, that when you learn math, 2 and 2 is 5, 7, 8, 4. Finally, you make tries and you fail. But social efforts are the same way. Give them opportunities to make mistakes. I worked with one kid. Well, he's not really a kid. He was almost an adult. But at 5, he got into a fight with another hearing boy. And the parents were like, oh my gosh, communication is the problem. We can't have him fighting. They took him home, and he stayed home for 10 years. Never went to school. And then they sent him to me when he was 15. And, yes, children are going to make mistakes. They're going to learn in the same way that you learned. Trial and error. And that's fine. Praise the effort. Whether it's academics, social skills, try. And again, Sherry was talking about, what's going on around them. We were talking with a friend. She is studying for a PhD, intelligent lady. And we were talking about, her parents are fluent in ASL, but it happened, we were talking about parents arguing. And she really didn't know that her parents argued. And why? Because, they argued in the bedroom, and had whatever conversation. I need to let you know that sometimes, maybe once every 5 years, my wife and I argue. Maybe a little bit more often than that, but whatever. I'm sure that you do too. If you live with another person, husband, wife, partner, whatever, when you live with another person, you're going to have arguments. Do your deaf kids know that you argue? Do they know how you resolve that argument? And what strategies did you use to resolve the argument? How do you manage to get along with your partner? But if you have that conversation in private, my friend, again, she's studying for her PhD, and she just didn't realize that hearing kids could hear arguments of neighbors. If you live in an apartment, you can hear them upstairs and downstairs, to the left and to the right, in front of you and behind you. You can hear people arguing outside, in the street. People are arguing on the bus, and you hear how people resolve those arguments. And if you don't hear, how do you know how that happens? So, kind of a last little tip. If you don't have a video phone, get one. They're free. The phone companies, I am sure there are lots of people who'd be happy to help you find a video phone. There are a lot out there. They're happy to provide them. That means that even for a kid who's 5 or 6, my grandchildren, who are 2 and 3, call me. Do your deaf kids call their grandparents? For no reason at all, just to say, hi, Granddad. Even if they don't sign, just to see the face. If all they do is wave back, that's fine. So get a video phone. Start them out as early as you can, 4, 5, 6 years old. Let them, as they get older, let them order pizza, call their friends. I remember when they first came out with video phones. At that time, we didn't pay for them, but the technology itself initially was very expensive. My girls, don't want to talk negative about teenage girls, but my girls would call their friends. $4,000 of equipment at our end, $4,000 of equipment at the other end. Hey, what are you doing? Nothing. What are you doing? Nothing. Okay, for a half an hour, they'd talk about nothing. All right, fine. But of course, that's the same that the same conversation that all kids have. So provide that opportunity. Video phones are there, use it.
Your deaf child will have to learn how to interact in the hearing world because deaf people are a minority group within the larger hearing society. So you, as parents, will need to give him the tools to learn how to navigate the hearing world. You can start doing that when they're very young. For example, in restaurants. I'm sure many of you have gone out to eat once in a while. Maybe at a fast food place, McDonald's, Burger King, Taco Bell, wherever. Often, it's easier for the parent to order food for everyone, including the deaf child. That does not do your child any favors. Even if they're only 6 or 7 or 8 years old, encourage them to order food for themselves. How can they do that? They can write down their order on a napkin, for example, or use their phone to type it out in text. There's a cool app called Big, B-I-G, that you can download onto your phone. They can type on the phone and show their order to the server. For example, they could type out Big Mac, just as an example. And then they can see the words up on the menu, type them out, and then hold it up for the server to see. Do encourage your child to interact with hearing people. Order for themselves, or they can go to a grocery store, and if they can't find something, find a way to ask someone. They have to learn to communicate with hearing people and not to depend upon their hearing parents all the time.
I'll give you an example. One of our kids, it was so fun to watch. We were over at Starbucks, and you all know there's a Starbucks everywhere. Of course, she herself is deaf. She walks up to the counter, points to her ears, shakes her head, and of course, what does the person at the counter say? Uses speech. My daughter just looks at him, rolls her eyes, points again to her ears, shakes her head, and of course, and again the counter person says, "What would you like to order?" So my daughter does what? Points to them, says, "No, move out of the way," looks around the restaurant to see who's not looking up at the ceiling, studying the ceiling tiles, as some people do, because they don't want to interact. Sadly, but true. There are folks who don't want to talk to deaf folks, but there's always somebody who's got a pencil, paper, and a notepad out and ready. And so she pointed to them, said, "You, come take my order." And they went back and forth, and they did just fine. I was standing right behind her, and I do not interpret for her. She didn't need me. She could do it herself. She's independent, and that's what you want. You want to encourage that. You know, if you're hearing, you know hearing culture. Explain it again. Make that implicit information explicit. That might mean, for example, hearing people just kind of sadly let you know we lie. If you meet a friend that you haven't seen for 20 years and you meet them for the first time and you say, "Oh, you look great, you haven't changed a bit," and we all know that's a lie, but it's part of hearing culture. Deaf people meet somebody they haven't seen for that same 20 years. "Wow, you've gained weight. Your hair is great." Yes, I know, I admit it, I know, but you know, that's just a different culture. Which is better? None. None is better, but they're different. So as hearing people, we know the rules. You need to explain it. You know, this is the way hearing people do it. But again, as we talked about, you know, the video relay system, VRS, to order a pizza, to interact with their hearing friends. If they're in mainstream school, call their friends and talk about nothing at all, or homework, or whatever.
This will give them training on how to make calls in the future for various services. If they learn how to use the video phone when they're young, the video relay system, they can make simple calls like ordering a pizza or finding out what time a place opens, or other simple tasks. then they are better prepared in the future to make calls such as calling the water company to arrange for water hookup at their new apartment, or calling the electric company about an error with their bill, or calling a doctor in the future to make an appointment. Start with some simple, basic calls when they are young and build up to the more complicated calls in the future that they will be making when they become more independent and living on their own.
So, what is competitive employment? What does that mean? Again, it starts at home. Chores. We expect our deaf kids to do the same things: take care of the dog, clean the room, vacuum, wash dishes, whatever it is. It's all going to be the same. At school, many of us started work. I started work when I was 15, washing dishes in a restaurant. We expect our deaf kids to do the same. Look for part-time work. I know that sometimes, that means you also have got to teach them to drive. As I talked about earlier, in some ways I had a dangerous job, but teaching deaf kids to drive. I don't like IEP meetings, but I think teaching to drive is a little bit more dangerous. See this finger? It's broken. My wife told me to get it fixed when it first happened, and I didn't. But anyway, how did that happen? I was teaching one of my daughters to drive. And it's hard with deaf kids. Why? Because at some point you want them to look at you, and you also want them to look at the road. And we're not fish. Our eyes cannot work independently. So we went right through a red light. I just jammed my hand so hard into the dash, I broke my finger. Ow. But you got to teach them how to drive when they're young, just like with hearing kids. Teach them how to get to work, and teach them how to go to IEP meetings, as bad as they are. Again, so we want to start that vocational discussion at the age of 14. Involve VR. That's the law. Sometimes the VR workers are like, no, I don't need to go there. That's the school's responsibility. No, we want them to open a case. We want to start that conversation. We want to start talking about part-time work, not to wait until 18 or 21 or 25.
Speaking of VR, open a case with the VR counselor when they are 14 years old. Invite the VR counselor to the IEP meetings. VR can help your child find a part-time job or even send them to summer camp for training. Some states have VR training programs for young teenagers. Unfortunately, those programs are often geared for hearing teenagers and harder for a deaf child to join those programs with the need for interpreters, and it's tough for them to feel comfortable there. Sometimes you may feel stuck with that, but it's better than nothing. Some states do have good training programs geared toward deaf teenagers. It becomes the parent's responsibility to find those programs. So yes, open a case. Some schools may want to wait until they are juniors or seniors before involving VR, but do not wait. It's better to begin when they are in the 9th grade. Definitely get VR involved so your child will get to know who their VR counselor will be, and the VR counselor will get to know your child, their skills, and their abilities. So that is very important. For the transition goals at the IEP meetings, make sure they are good goals and not overly simplified. Filling out a job application form. Now, that would be a good goal for 9th grade for a 14-year-old. Sometimes job application forms can be complicated. They may run into vocabulary words they don't know, or they don't know where to find the necessary information. That would be a good transition goal for a 14-year-old. You can add more complex goals as they become older and go through high school. Hopefully, when setting goals, you can add volunteer work, such as working at an animal shelter or volunteering at a restaurant where they learn job skills. They won't get paid for volunteering, But they can learn skills to prepare them to find a real part-time job and, in the future, obtain a full-time job.
So we've talked about academics, but we also need to talk about emotion, and that's important. We talk about communication. And often, when I work one-to-one as counseling with deaf adults, they talk about dinner table syndrome. And that meant that they felt left out. One study that I did, I looked at deaf kids compared with hearing kids, and the deaf kids might have one or two sentences where the hearing kids might have had 500 interactions in that same 1 hour of dinner table conversation. So involve them in that conversation. Let them know what's going on. Don't use that bad word later. I'll tell you later, because deaf adults know that later never comes. So involve them in those conversations. If you see they're quiet, if you see that their grades are going a little bit downhill, involve them. Yes, I know that teenagers don't like to talk. They're going to roll their eyes and sigh. But keep that conversation, even if the only answer that you get is just to stop so that you'll stop harassing them. Keep that conversation going on, paying attention, because you know your kids better than the school knows the kids. So keep that attention on their emotions. Figure out what's normal for that age. Now, understand that teenagers, it's a roller coaster ride, and that's fine. It doesn't mean it's going to be perfectly stable, but you've got to remember that social emotional information, as Sherry was talking about, that implicit thing, that what's going on in the family, who's having a hard time, who's struggling with their emotions, so that hopefully they know that people go to a counselor, that maybe they read the news and they can see that so-and-so has just gone to a mental health setting. There was a senator who just went and received mental health treatment. So again, we can have that conversation and provide that information and know what options are out there.
It's possible that at times your child may not feel comfortable talking with you because some of their issues may be related to them being deaf. Their parents are hearing. I've had my own deaf kids tell me hearing people are lucky. They have an easier time in life while we deaf people have to constantly struggle. Those are the times when it might be good for your child to talk with a deaf adult in the community. Maybe they feel, well, mom and dad won't understand because they are hearing, whereas another deaf adult will understand because they themselves have experienced the same struggles growing up. So they may feel more comfortable talking with another deaf person. I don't want your deaf child to be limited to talking only with their parents and not with others. Hearing children have aunts and uncles to talk with, grandparents they can talk to, or maybe a neighbor who has babysat for them often and they feel comfortable talking with her. They have many people they can talk with. Maybe at a particular time, they don't feel comfortable talking with their parents. Or maybe there isn't an opportunity to talk with their parents because they're busy. And then they'd have other people that they can talk with instead. Try to help your deaf child to develop that same social network to deal with their emotions, struggles, questions, and concerns. And pay attention to your child. You know them the best. If you feel perhaps another person might be better for them to talk with, suggest some options. Ask them if they want to talk with this person.
So, in summary, normal is a word we don't even talk about in our house. It's just a setting on the dryer, and that's it. Every child is unique. Every family is unique. Your home is different than our home. I hope your home isn't as chaotic as ours is sometimes. We have 8, 9 kids at home some days, and it's never boring. but each family is unique, and you know your family. And language. Without language, communication doesn't happen. So it's so critical, and we can't emphasize enough that talk about everything that goes on. What you hear is often, whether even on a train, we might be listening to what's going on. In a restaurant, I hear what's going on, conversations around me. Hearing kids are getting that information. They say that we learn 70 to 80% of what you learn. You don't learn from somebody telling you directly. You get it from hearing those side conversations. So provide that information. Provide socialization opportunities with deaf kids, with hearing kids. Be a bicultural, bilingual family. Help them make decisions. Don't decide for your child, but decide with them. And, that's a process that starts when they're very small. Where do you want to eat? As a parent, I'm not going to decide, do you want chicken or whatever?
For example, when you ask your children where to eat, don't let your hearing children decide by calling out the names of restaurants. Give your deaf child the opportunity to express their desired restaurant. Ask each child individually, okay, where do you want to eat? Now, sometimes parents will just call out in the car, hey, you guys, where do you want to eat? And then they listen to the suggested answers. The deaf child has no opportunity then to participate in that decision. It's important to include your deaf child in decisions and not let your other hearing children control everything.
So that often means that it takes time, a little bit more patience to talk to each other. Our child when you've got 3 languages going on all at the same time. English. One time we had 2 girls who were speaking Russian, and one girl who was speaking Chinese, and one who was speaking Korean, and 4 deaf kids and 2 hearing kids using English. Oh my gosh, it was just, nobody could talk to everybody, but everybody had the opportunity to talk to at least one other person. So again, teach your child to be assertive. Like my daughter at the Starbucks, telling them, no, not that person, but this person, and that's just fine with me. They need that assertiveness later on in life, and that has to start when they're small. Teach them how to ask for an interpreter. Even if they're 8, they can ask for an interpreter, and that's just fine. We talk about jobs in the future, about what deaf people can do. King Jordan, former president of Gallaudet University, he said deaf people can do everything except hear, which is true. Deaf people can do any variety of jobs.
If you have more questions or want us to expand or elaborate on some issues, feel free to contact us at our email address here, wmshouse@gmail.com. Thank you.
Thank you for paying attention, and hope that you recognize that your family is not normal, but unique.